Hello, and welcome to Tomorrow's Tech by IDTechEx. I am your host, Shazan Siddiqi, for today's podcast. And in this podcast series, we will be interviewing an array of industry experts on emerging technology from IDTechEx. IDTechEx is a market intelligence company with a mission to provide clarity on emerging technologies. In each episode, our analysts will be discussing all kinds of topics, everything from virtual and augmented reality hardware, autonomous vehicles and flying cars, sustainability and energy storage innovations, medtech and wearables, 3D printing, advanced materials, and so much more. In each interview, we will explore what the future outlook is for each of these technologies, as well as endeavoring to find that elusive insight into hype versus reality. The topic of today's podcast is quantum computing. A quantum computer isn't just a more powerful version of the computers we use today, as far as I understand it. It's something else entirely. Quantum physics is taught to us in schools and universities to understand the fundamental nature of the universe, and you've probably heard about quantum computers. Maybe you've seen the race for quantum supremacy between governments and companies, or read that quantum computers will break all encryption, or heard terms like qubits or superposition or quantum mechanics in a very confusing TV segment or YouTube video. But you might be wondering, what does a quantum computer actually do, and how could it actually change industries and affect our lives? So, in today's podcast, I'll be interviewing our in house expert on quantum computers, Dr. Tess Skyrme, about this fascinating technology, its applications, and to finally learn the truth about quantum computers. Tess, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, the world of quantum computing, it's a fascinating one for me. But, before we go on this crazy adventure to try and unravel, like I said, the truth of quantum computing, let's start simple for our audience. In simple terms, what is actually a quantum computer and how is it different to a conventional computer?
Yeah, good question. I like to start at the absolute basics with this question. So, for anybody that has never heard about how a quantum computer works at all,
Hmm.
the fundamentals are that it can solve a completely new set of problems compared to a classical computer, but also, perhaps more crucially, it can solve other problems a lot faster.
Hmm.
And some of the statistics you sometimes hear is that some problems it might take a classical computer trillions of years or kind of the age of the universe to solve, a quantum computer could solve on a more feasible timescale. So that's kind of the elevator pitch for the
Right.
technology.
Hmm. Right. And, I've heard of supercomputers as well, but I'm not really sure I understand the difference between a conventional computer that I'm currently using, whereas where does a supercomputer slot in all of this versus a quantum computer like you've just mentioned?
Yeah. So the that kind of brings us to the next level of understanding about this, which is that a classical computer works using transistors. These are
Hmm.
basically switches that can be in a state of either a one or a zero.
Hmm.
And people might be familiar with the idea of Moore's law and the fact that transistors have got smaller and smaller and smaller over the decades, in big parts thanks to kind of innovations in semiconductor manufacturing, to a point now where you can get billions of transistors in your phones and your laptops to do pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah.
And a supercomputer is basically, in very oversimplified terms, kind of just more transistors, more classical computers together in data centers, taking up quite a large amount of space to tackle kind of, some of the world's biggest problems. Um, a classical computer is different because it doesn't use a switch like a transistor to be one or zero.
Hmm.
It uses what is known as a qubit or a quantum bit. And because of quantum mechanics and fundamental theory ideas like superposition and entanglement and other stuff, which ultimately people don't really need to understand more about this market. But it means that you can do some of the problems it would take these supercomputers to solve with billions, trillions of transistors with a reduced number of qubits. So maybe hundreds or thousands of qubits to do
Right.
a similar size problem. So
Okay.
that's some of the basics, yeah.
Uh-huh. So to maybe recap what you've just said, Tess, and to fully, make sure our audience is understanding as well. This is actually the first time I've got to understand how a quantum computer works. So it's not the speed of the individual operations; it's the number of operations it takes to sort of reach a result. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, um, another way to maybe think about this is, again, really oversimplifying. But sometimes in classical computing, you might think about doing operations in parallel. So
Hmm.
lots of things doing certain computations at the same time. This is somewhat analogous to the way qubits work together, because large groups of qubits can be entangled
Right.
and ultimately do a lot of computations analogously to parallel, in a
Hmm.
way that means that they can get to a solution a lot quicker.
Right.
So it's not necessarily, in fact, to bring on your point, qubits, one of the challenges with them is that actually they can be very slow.
Hmm.
But it's the power of using them in an entangled group that really brings the benefit.
I see. Okay. Interesting. Um, let's talk about the other buzzword in the industry currently, artificial intelligence, AI.
Mm.
So, do quantum computing and AI go hand in hand? Are they complementary technologies, or is one going to pose a threat to the other?
Yeah, it depends who you talk to.
Okay.
So, on the one hand, AI is kind of pulling some of the public attention and the investment attention
Hmm.
away from quantum, and in one hand, that's potentially negatively impacting the industry.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the narrative is that, as much as quantum computing is this revolutionary approach compared to classical computing, it won't exist on its own. Classical
Hmm.
computers and quantum computers will be worked in hybrid.
Hmm.
And that kind of extends to AI. Like, AI can be used in ways to complement quantum and vice versa. I think
Right.
quantum machine learning is a kind of a field all of its own. And I think, commercially, there's a lot of evidence for the latter point, that it's more complementary, because
Hmm.
players like Nvidia, who are so leading in AI, are also investing heavily in the quantum ecosystem as well. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think, somewhat depends who you speak to, but probably mostly a friend as opposed to a foe.
Uh-huh. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I would have imagined because, my understanding is simply that, artificial intelligence requires a lot of compute power and, sounds like quantum computing is, trying to push those boundaries. So I would imagine that, yeah, the most advanced AIs would at some point, try and leverage the power that's brought about with the quantum computing technology. Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, I think it's certainly the case that um, developers will be looking for the most valuable synergies between the
Hmm.
two. I think that the contrast a little bit is that one of the big challenges with AI is that it's incredibly compute intensive,
Yeah.
and quantum, kind of at its core, is trying to do more with less.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I think in the near term, there could be a little bit of competition between the two, as I say, for investment or maybe early use case development. People could get persuaded away from quantum to an AI solution. But I
Right.
think in the long term, this kind of classical quantum hybrid world will see them kind of quite happily together.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. Let's go back to quantum computing and keep our focus on quantum computers for now. How are quantum computers benchmarked or even compared to each other in performance? So if I go out to buy a traditional computer today, I'll be looking at the specification sheet, looking at things like the CPU clock speed, what kind of
Mhm.
GPU it has, what kind of RAM it has. But what are companies and what are people looking at when they look at how a quantum computer works?
Yeah, so there's a long list of these, and a growing list.
Okay.
A few things that is important for people to have probably some clarity on. So, not so much a benchmark, but one important kind of definition within quantum computing
Hmm.
is that some quantum computers are gate based, which means they will try and work like a classical computer where you do kind of subsequent operations to compute an algorithm. And others aren't gate based. They might use a method like annealing. And annealing is kind of similarly to where you might have heard it in engineering in terms of kind of annealing steel.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little bit like heating something up and letting it cool. You kind
Mm.
of prepare the problem and let it relax into a low energy state in a way that also leverages qubits. So in both instances, an important benchmark is the number of qubits to an
Okay.
extent. So qubit number is a benchmark that's been used for quite a long time.
Hmm.
And again, in simple terms, quantum annealing is somewhat simpler to implement from a hardware perspective than gate based quantum computing. So you will see already that the leading quantum annealing company, D-Wave, has thousands of qubits which it can use for quantum annealing.
I see.
However, on the other side, in the gate based community, they are still really competing to grow their qubit number because having lots of qubits working in a gate based way is more complicated. So, there you will see companies range from having one or two qubits up to maybe 1,000 if you're somebody like IBM. So that's the
Yeah.
main one is qubit number, but just important to keep it in context that there is
Mhm.
also more to it when you're
Right.
comparing companies.
I see. So, just a quick question off the back of this: would it be, when you travel around the world and go to conferences and attend, events on quantum computers, is that the sort of statistic most companies are trying to advertise, like their qubit number?
So historically, it was. I would say that in the recent years, the shift that has been made is that because as the competition rises,
Hmm.
qubit number isn't everything, is more of the narrative that you will hear now,
Okay.
which is very true. So, as I mentioned, there's a long list of benchmarks. Other
Hmm.
ones would be kind of coherence time, which is
Hmm.
ultimately how long your qubit survives before it stops being a qubit, which is
Right.
a huge problem for the industry, noise effects. So
Hmm.
that's an important benchmark. You will also hear about quantum volume, which is ultimately about how complicated a quantum circuit you're able to run on your system. You mentioned kind of the speed of a computer when you're looking at it, comparing different systems. Gate speed is also an important one in
Right.
the gate based quantum computing world. Um, so, qubit number isn't everything, it's more of the narrative. And I would say in the last 12 months, the benchmark that people are most interested in is logical qubit number,
Hmm.
which is so if I just take a step back for a second, I said you have these qubits, which are these quantum bits. They have a problem that they are really impacted by noise.
Hmm.
They're noisy, they have lots of errors. If you want to make a perfect qubit that hasn't got any errors, you basically have to use a group of them together. So 1,000, or for example, noisy qubits can be used together in a group to make one error-free or logical qubit. So because of that, the benchmark of most interest at the moment, I would say, is in the gate-based community is heavily on the logical qubit number.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Still with you there. So,
Yeah.
trying to keep up, but yeah. Uh, so yeah, let's move away from the technical aspects. So let's talk about the commercialization aspects of this technology, Tess. Who are some of the leading players in this field, and what is their current state of their technology?
Yeah, good question. So, I think most people will be really aware of IBM. They're one of the most prominent players in the space, but they're actually probably one of about 40 to 50 active quantum hardware developers. And yeah, the report that we've just put out in IDTechEx kind of goes into a lot of depth about the technical pros and cons of the hardware being developed by each of these companies that I won't bore everybody with an in-depth analysis of now. Um, but essentially, the state of it is they are all competing to show scalability. They are all competing to show that they can have higher number of logical qubits and they can do it in a feasible way. And this means they're experimenting with different methods outside of just doing it with superconductors, which is what IBM have been doing for a long time.
Hmm.
So they're trying to find ways of using light, silicon, diamond, kind of cold atoms, laser cooling. So there's a whole R&D ecosystem now out there of people trying to find more scalable ways, basically to compete with people like IBM who have led for the longest time.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Um, I did engineering at university, Tess, and I remember I used to run a lot of fluid flow simulations on the darn university computers, and
Yeah.
oftentimes they would just crash. And I once had this PhD researcher just walk by and make a smirk comment saying, "Oh yeah, once we have quantum computers, this will be done in seconds." And I still remember sitting at my desk, for sometimes hours on ends, waiting for fluid flow problems to be resolved. So I guess I'm pivoting towards what are the sort of applications where quantum computers will be used, and is this a future where I can run simulations at much faster speeds than conventional computers? And if you could just highlight some other industries that could benefit from using quantum computing technology.
Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head, really. So it's complex simulation problems, optimization problems, quantum chemistry problems, materials and drug discovery problems more broadly. So, for example, with fluid simulations that you mentioned, that's an active use case of Rolls-Royce that they've been investigating for a long time, trying to do speed up with quantum computing.
Hmm.
Um, I will say that actually CFD is probably more niche than some of the others. There is a very strong interest in the material discovery side, particularly for battery chemistry simulations, kind of in response to the kind of electrification in the mobility market, and also for drug discovery timeline acceleration as well. That's one that comes up time and time again.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, all of them sound really interesting. Yeah, it sounds to me like there's plenty of industries there that could benefit from the advent of such technology. So yeah, sounds like there's a lot at stake for a lot of different industries here. But
Yeah. So I'm
then,
just going to quickly follow up on that, because you're
sure.
exactly right. I would say that the one of the challenges for the industry is that a lot of these potential stakeholders are still a little bit reticent
Mm,
about how to engage. Quite often, they might have a very broad use case like quantum chemistry or materials discovery that is of interest,
right.
but pinning down exactly which problem to solve and exactly which bit is best run on a quantum computer versus a supercomputer
Hmm.
takes quite a lot of expertise, and there's a bit of dearth of that in industry. So yeah, a lot at stake, a lot of potential value creation, but some challenges from the application side as well.
Right. I think this segues us perfectly into my next question, actually. So, what are some of the challenges in bringing such hardware to market, and why haven't we just seen lots of news headlines about quantum computers being actively used?
Yeah, so the first thing is, as I just mentioned, that this kind of talent crisis or talent shortage is, I think, certainly slowing things down a little
Hmm.
bit. Um, Also, I think there are those that make the headlines and those that don't. So, for example, I mentioned the quantum annealing way of doing things, which has got kind of commercial customers kind of claiming that in the next year or two they will be using it commercially to do things like optimization problem solving in logistics for auto scheduling.
Yeah.
So that's something that is kind of actively due to be happening.
Mm.
But on the gate based side of things, there are some challenges very much in the scalability of the systems. For example, I mentioned that a lot of these technologies are trying to compete with the superconducting way of doing things, but
Yeah.
actually, all of them or most of them still depend on cooling in some way,
Mm.
whether it be again with kind of cryostats or specialist refrigerators or using high power lasers to cool atoms down.
Mm.
These kind of power and space intensive ways of getting systems cold do limit, the kind of the commercial viability for some of the systems.
Right.
Um, but it's also that the science and the understanding to go from having a handful of qubits entangled to thousands or millions of them,
Hmm.
and designing the architecture to support that is just brand new for the world. It's kind of considered a bit of a space race. Like, this is probably some of the hardest technical challenges that as a species we've ever really tried to tackle
Wow.
without being too dramatic. But that's kind of how it gets discussed, is that achieving scalability in this field will be a huge milestone for
Right.
humanity. So,
Mhm.
going from something like, oh, it's hard to recruit, to this is the hardest thing humans have ever done, this is kind of the arena of challenges in this market.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Sounds like this could be, the innovation of the century, if you will.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess, that last bit there has shot off quite a few questions that I want to follow up with, actually. Well, you mentioned a bit about the hardware requirements, and a bit about thermal management of such. The cooling requirements will be quite intensive. So it makes me imagine that, I kind of almost want to answer this next question myself. But will such quantum computing technology ever make its way into consumer electronics? So the smartphone that you and me use, a laptop that I can perhaps purchase, will it possibly ever be used there?
So I personally, I would be more reluctant to say that there's no chance of that than that there is, despite all of the challenges. And that's
Hmm.
potentially a little bit controversial, but the reason for that opinion is if you go back to what computers looked like in the middle of the 20th century with rooms full of vacuum tubes, I
Yeah.
don't think many were predicting something like the smartphone.
Yep.
So, our ability to miniaturize technologies and innovate in a way to do that, I don't think should be underestimated. That being said, look at the timescale that it took for us to get there. It is not something that can be done quickly. It's decades and decades of innovation to get there.
Yeah.
Um, I do think, as I mentioned, there's this big challenge in cooling for a lot of the platforms, but a lot of the innovation right now is surrounding how can we make these systems run at slightly warmer temperatures? How can we make them less power demanding? And there is a modality out there based on diamond, which is already fundamentally room temperature. And when I
Hmm.
speak to companies in the diamond space, for example, Seed or looking at the work done by companies like Quantum Brilliance, a lot of their IP and a lot of their value is in the fact that this stuff can be done without cooling. And they will quite happily talk about the potential for something like edge IoT applications of quantum using their systems. They
I
might
see.
not be quite as complex or as impressive as the full scale quantum computer doing something like cracking all of encryption, but they
Hmm.
could still have a role in smaller scale electronics in the very long term. That's
Right.
that, that's kind of my opinion about it. Don't rule it out.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I see it is, so we see, of course, with AI being a buzzword in the industry right now, a lot of actually consumer electronics companies are trying to sort of capitalize on that, and will try and advertise products saying, AI integrated, or
Hmm.
whereas, they're not actually locally on device running any large language models or anything like
Yeah.
that. This is all, edge stuff. Which basically for our audience means that, it's being run centrally off a cloud,
Hmm.
in a data center somewhere else, but the user is made to believe that, oh, my phone's suddenly capable of all of these new things. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely a sort of a realm of, marketing that is often applied to such technologies. But yeah, I guess my next question then was, just following on from that, so the business model for quantum computers, will that very much remain, like I said before, where the hardware remains centrally accessible via a cloud, and then the users of these big organizations will just perhaps pay a fee to access its features?
Yeah, broadly speaking, yes. So, because of the infrastructure requirements of these systems, in most instances, it will be that they are, in a data center or in, privately held somewhere else and accessed by the cloud by
Mhm.
end users. Um, there's a bit of a trend there. I think that companies are aware that because of the dependence on cloud, a lot of the value is being captured by third party cloud
Mhm.
providers, and some of the hardware developers. My feeling is that they're getting a little bit more wise to that, and as such, looking to host their own clouds, and you make remote access possible through their own systems. So that business model evolution, I think, is already at play. But there also will be customers who do want their own on-premises hardware. I think in the last 18 months, somewhere between 10 and 20 systems have been bought for on-premises use. That being said, that is very much by customers like research institutes or supercomputing centers who want to bolster what they've got in house, mainly to experiment more with how these things could add value long term.
Mhm.
But I also hear from people who, because of the need for very high data security, or they don't want to share access of the machine with somebody else, they just want their own,
Yeah.
there probably will be some on-premises demand as well. But I
Mm.
think for the most part, in the near term, it's going to stay this cloud accessed system.
Right. And I think just to add, I feel like there would be a geopolitical angle to this as well. I think it's often a priority and often a national strategic priority for a lot of nations to, be the first to, like you mentioned, this is analogous to the space race.
Hmm.
So I imagine, if China cracked the code and actually had, the quantum computers well ahead of, the US or Europe, they wouldn't want to share any of that technology.
Yeah, absolutely. The space race, I think, is kind of the perfect analogy, because nations are really competing not only to kind of make the best machine and
Mm,
have, it's also to capture the value in their local economies that would come from being a leader in quantum. So it's about national security and the economy.
mm,
And that's really kind of, I think, become more clear in recent years. Kind of national strategies specifically related to how to deal with quantum technology from a development and a kind of risk assessment perspective have really grown. And also, I think that there's a real focus on bolstering local ecosystems. So companies are really encouraged to collaborate within other companies who could support them in the supply chain in their localities, which on the one hand is perfectly sensible, and is a way that a lot of emerging technologies are kind of fostered by
yeah.
governments. But it does also, from my perspective, potentially limit the freedom, or for partners to find the collaborators that is the best fit to accelerate the industry as fast as it needs to go.
Hmm.
So there's a bit of a nationalism versus collaboration dynamic at play as well, on the back of the geopolitical significance.
Right. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Um, I wanted to ask about the potential value chain that this opens up then. And, a lot of our audience will be from various industries. So I'm just wondering what opportunities exist within this, quantum computing value chain from an infrastructure perspective. Are there opportunities for thermal management companies, specialty material developers, so forth and so on?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think kind of materials for quantum, components for quantum is a really hot area at the moment, because, as I mentioned, so much of the R&D is about developing architectures and systems that can be more scalable, be less power hungry, actually allow quantum computers to perform the way they are theoretically designed to do. That's going to take a lot of material innovation.
Hmm.
So, for example, across all of the different modalities, the need for kind of photonics is really clear. A lot of these systems need better photodetectors or photon sources. In other instances, the fact that this stuff has to be cooled down means that thermal management in a less typical way than we might be used to is really important.
Yeah.
Um, it's about, how do I get a lot of wiring into my cryostat without heating it up? And if I
Mhm.
want more wiring for more qubits, how do I combat that? And there's some really cool companies like Seek, a company that are specifically developing alternatives to lots of microwave wiring in order to solve a lot of kind of the thermal management and scalability challenges.
Yeah.
But there's also kind of at the research level, there are still those looking at different materials that could be used as the fundamental building blocks for quantum bits.
Hmm.
So, the 2D material space is an example of that. There are graphene and CNT players looking to get into the game, despite the fact that there's already so many commercial players. So
Yeah.
yeah, lots of opportunity in the supply chain for sure.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Um, I guess I wanted to ask about you have this one really interesting bit in your executive summary for this report about the tipping point for quantum
Mm.
computing. I wanted to ask you if you could talk us through what it took to even what's the research that goes behind figuring out what the tipping point is and how you came to the conclusions.
Yeah, so there's a few potential important kind of industry tipping points. So one that gets talked about a lot is Q day. So this is, when will this day arrive when a quantum computer breaks all of encryption? People
Mm,
worried about that. There's also the inflection point of, when will these machines start generating commercial value? And perhaps beyond that, when will they really offer a big return on investment?
yeah.
Um, the research that I've done to try and come up with sensible narratives around these inflection points is basically just by looking in detail at every player in the space. What is their roadmap? How does that roadmap compare to are the critical appraisals of the likely speed of scale up of the technologies?
Hmm.
How do other analysts within IDTechEx and their understanding about the worlds of semiconductor and photonics and computing, relate to these narratives that I'm seeing?
Yeah.
And also compare a lot with what's happening on the software development side, because as much as quantum computing hardware is scaling up, there's also a need to write quantum algorithms that put these commercially relevant problems into a quantum form. And that's a whole industry in itself. So trying to compare where
Right.
those guys are at in terms of how many qubits they think they'll need with
Mm.
how many qubits are on offer. So taking a lot into consideration, but trying to take a quite a rigorous approach to coming up with those timelines.
I see. And I guess I wanted to ask next about perhaps the challenges with forecasting such a market. I
Mm.
personally would have found it very challenging, but I see the report does forecast this technology based on a number of metrics. So if you could just talk us briefly through what those kind of forecasts look like. What are we forecasting exactly when we're looking at the quantum computing market?
Yeah, so at IDTechEx, we take quite a unique stance on forecasting this market. We focus very strongly on the value being created by hardware sales of systems,
Hmm.
on the basis that, yeah, we see a lot of the opportunity in the material and supply chain side. Other methods of forecasting would be to consider the value that could be created by quantum computing, or the revenue being generated by all of these companies, not just in hardware sales, but also in offering things like consulting services or all of the software stack side of the industry. So we've really tried to focus in on the hardware opportunity.
Right.
And again, that's largely informed by the work that we did to interrogate the different timelines that we mentioned before, and then kind of relating that to the different modalities. And of course, now we're in the privileged position whereby there's more data around from companies who are actually, as I say, selling some of their systems for on premises, so we can get more
Mm.
bottom up information about what's actually being sold, and use that to refine our models.
Yeah, I see. And just a quick one, Tess, is do we have any sort of information on what such a system would cost, like pricing or cost information?
Yeah, so that is, that's an area in the industry where I think there's a good amount of uncertainty, just
Mm.
because, and we do have some information on it in the report, absolutely,
Hmm.
but because the market is largely what's called by research for research,
Right.
largely it's about government funding being used to buy a quantum computer system from a commercial player to facilitate further research. So as a result of that, there is a kind of a symbiotic relationship. There's a win for the commercial player in terms of supplying the system. It gives them credibility. It encourages users to use their platform.
Hmm.
It gives them more know-how about their own system. So the price that they're charging for the system may not be what the price would be in the long term if they had something generating value that they would supply to a user. And you also have to factor in things like the fact that these government contracts are often multi-year. So
Yeah.
maybe they're buying a $15-20 million system, but they'll get 5 million this year, 5 million next year, 5 million the next. And as you'll imagine, because of the nature of competition in the industry right now, the willingness of players to divulge exactly how their pricing is working is fairly limited because of the competition. But yeah, it's in the millions for sure, the tens of millions for the most advanced machines.
Okay. Yeah. That would make sense. Yeah. Okay, it's been a very fascinating conversation, Tess. I guess I would want to ask you now, what is the sort of one key takeaway for our audience regarding the quantum computer market, or if you had to give me one phrase to encapsulate this market from your research?
Yeah, so I have turned to a recent article I published on this to provide you with a bit of a one phrase,
Hmm.
because I've recently put an article out where I said that the quantum computing market is an ultra marathon, not a sprint. And mostly, I really, really stand by that. Like this is a tech that, if you follow its roots back, is back in the middle of the 20th century for theory, and it could still be 10, 20 years more away from kind of really delivering on its
Hmm.
promises. So yeah, that would be the main thing I would suggest people take away. Um, if I could follow up slightly, I would say that if I could refine my one liner,
Sure. Yeah.
it would be that with the analogy of the race that I gave, that comes a link to the question that I am asked the most by our clients, which is which quantum computing hardware or company will kind of quote unquote win.
Right.
And I think it's really important when people are asking that question to decide what they mean by winning. And it really centers around all of the questions that you've asked me today, because physicists are going to care the most about the technical benchmarks. Investors want a quick ROI. End users want the value creation moment. Material and component suppliers want that higher volume demand. And the perspective on who wins in each of those regards is very different.
Right.
And yeah, just to say that that's kind of the topic and the arena that we've really tried to investigate in the report and the research that we do at IDTechEx.
Brilliant. Yeah, all of that sounds fantastic. And yeah, some great explanations there, Tess. We started off this podcast by saying I want to unravel the truth about quantum computers. And I definitely feel, this has been a very insightful conversation. And I'm going to leave with so much more knowledge about the technology. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much for listening to Tomorrow's Tech, hosted by IDTechEx. IDTechEx offers independent market intelligence on emerging technologies. For more detailed information on this topic and many others, please go to idtechex.com, where there are dedicated research reports on the emerging technologies we cover, as well as articles and free-to-attend webinars.